Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this Friday afternoon. My name is Elliot Williams, and I'm the training coordinator at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. It may not be too dramatic to say that we are in a crisis of trust in the United States. Public trust in the federal government has been on the decline for decades, but has reached near record lows in recent years. Last year, just 23% of Americans reported that they trust the federal government, down by more than 10 points from 2022. That's according to a national survey conducted last year by the Partnership for Public Service, which we are here to discuss today. Over the past few weeks, the Trump administration has rolled out sweeping changes across federal agencies. Journalists are at a pivotal moment to help the public understand these actions and influence how people perceive and trust the federal government. To provide context and clarity on these issues, I'm joined by Max Stier, the founding president and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, an organization that takes a nonpartisan approach to building a better government and stronger democracy. Max, thank you for joining us.
Elliot, thank you very much for having me back.
Happy to have you. And Max has worked previously in all three branches of the federal government, most recently in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where he served as the Deputy General Counsel for Litigation. He clerked for former U.S. Supreme Court Justice David Souter in 1994 and served as Special Litigation Counsel to Assistant Attorney General Anne Bingaman at the Department of Justice. He also practiced white-collar defense at the firm Williams & Connolly and is a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Law School. A few things to note here before I turn it over to Max. We are recording this briefing. Highlights will appear on our website and in our daily newsletter for journalists, the latest, which you can subscribe to using the link in the chat. Feel free to submit questions in the chat or by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. Your questions will be addressed after the briefing, and please feel free to tell us where you're tuning in from. With that, I'll turn it over to Max.
Thanks again, Elliot. It's a pleasure to be participating in the great programming that you do. It's a wonderful service, and I'm looking forward to a conversation here. I'll give a few opening remarks, and then I hope everyone will put in their questions, and we can, again, try to address the specific issues that you have. So just as a beginning starting point here in terms of the Partnership for Public Service, worth sharing a little bit more about who we are and what we do. Specifically, as you heard, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that is focused on a better government and a stronger democracy. This is something that we've been doing now for more than 2 decades. Our programming is primarily focused on people issues. We've focused on trying to get good talent into government to make sure it's well led. Some of the key programming that we've done over time includes our Center for Presidential Transition, where we started a learning system 16 years ago about how to not just ensure that transitions were safe, but that they were actually effective or smooth. We also produced the Best Places to Work rankings, where we got a law passed to require all agencies in the federal government to conduct an annual employee survey. The intent there is really to provide good real-time performance information that can be compared across agencies as to how well they're managed and how well the leaders are doing there. We also produce the Service to America medals, the SAMMys, which is considered to be the Oscars of government service. Our theory is that no organization gets better if all you do is kick it. And the intent here is to make sure we're honoring the most innovative federal employees possible. Moving forward from some of the things that we do, it's worth trying to contextualize, what's happening in today's world, and it's a very difficult moment for our federal government. And I mentioned that we run the Center for Presidential Transition, but the reality is that this has been, I think, the most disruptive transition that I've ever seen, and that goes back a fair bit of time. Maybe we can move to the next slide, and we can talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening right now. This is really just a handful of the many things that have occurred that have really disrupted the environment in the federal government with respect to the federal workforce. I generally try to think about them in 2 categories, one of which are the things that have caused immediate disruption, and those include things like the firing of the inspector generals, or the firing of the prosecutors at the Department of Justice, or sidelining a lot of the senior talent in various agencies, moving them away from their area of expertise and putting them in positions where they actually don't have any expertise to get them out of the way. But the list is obviously much longer. The one issue that has taken a lot of attention is the fork in the road offer, the deferred resignation offer that has been made to almost the entire workforce. And that is obviously something not only in the news, but also has been at least temporarily halted. But there are also big changes to the system itself, and more specifically, efforts to return, frankly, our system to return it to the spoil system. And when I say the spoil system, what I mean is the system that was in place during the 19th century, in which federal jobs were given to loyalists and partisans, as opposed to experts and those that are committed to the public good. And to me, this is a very, very important story. And there's a lot that needs to be shared, both about what it might mean to the public and what it might mean to the federal workers themselves. In any event, though, hopefully we can get into some of these issues more fully if folks are interested during the Q&A session. Next slide. If we're looking at the issue that Elliot described here about trust, we've already heard the numbers are terrible, and they're getting worse. In so many ways, what we're seeing is not simply distrust of the federal government, but of all major institutions. I think very importantly, most Americans, when you ask them about the federal government, they really aren't actually thinking about civil servants. They're thinking about, in their words, maybe bickering politicians in Washington. And so I think part of what we've discovered is that when you do share information about who actually is doing the work of government, information about specific civil servants, that this actually changes attitudes across the board, no matter what the political persuasion is of the folks that are being communicated with. Maybe the next slide. I mentioned that one of the big changes we're seeing that I think is actually fundamental to our system of government and takes us back 140 years is this notion of returning to the spoil system. Also of great note from our research has been that is not what Americans want. And they actually do want a non-political, apolitical, merit-driven expert civil service. One of the challenges, though, is they don't believe they have it today. And there are real concerns about the quality of government that they are receiving. And we believe at the partnership that actually there's a lot of reform that should take place in the government. Again, a topic that we can go into later if folks are interested in. But the answer to it is not actually to return us to the spoil system, which frankly takes us in the exact wrong direction of where we need to go. So I think that's the quick front end here for everybody. We have lots of different resources at the partnership, so I hope you do check out what we have to offer. I will add that we are trying very hard to help civil servants right now who are faced with truly an extraordinary, chaotic, and challenging situation. So we are running webinars and have a whole microsite devoted to them. We also have research and information about the various executive orders and presidential memos that have been issued so far. So please do check out all of our resources and follow up with them. So with that, I hope folks will have plenty of questions and we can jump in.
Max, thank you so much for sharing these insights, and also to you for sharing these resources that are incredibly important right now. As Max said, we'll turn to questions from our viewers. Just a reminder that you can share questions in the chat or using the Q&A function. I think actually, while we allow people time to submit some questions, I'm going to start us off here. As a journalist, I always try to localize issues. And, I know the Washington Post reported in December that while the nation's capital and its surrounding suburbs may symbolize the federal bureaucracy that the current administration may wish to dismantle, most of the federal workforce more than 85% works elsewhere outside of the greater Washington area. Max, can you speak to what's at stake on a local level across the country when the public loses trust in the government and these bigger institutions, and how can journalists play a role in covering that and building trust?
Right. Elliot, so important on multiple points. First, just a quick primer on the civil service. You started us on that, and that's tremendous. There are approximately 2.3 million civil servants. Worth noting that that is about the same size as in headcount as it was in the 1960s. The makeup of the civil service and the type of work they do has changed a lot, but the actual headcount hasn't. It's not because government hasn't grown, a double negative. So government certainly has grown, but it hasn't grown fundamentally in the workforce. If anything, in terms of relative terms, it's shrunk. As in terms of the population growing since then by many tens of millions. You raised the important point that the vast bulk of those civil servants are not actually in the DC metro area. They are also a third veterans, so it's very purpose-driven workforce. Many people from the military who want to continue their service to the public do so by going into the civil service. We know this also from the data we have from our best places to work rankings. 70% or so are involved in national security, so there's a lot of focus on should we get rid of the Department of Education? There are 4,000 people in the Department of Education. There are 700,000 civilians at the Department of Defense. Over 450,000 at the VA. So again, just giving order of magnitude. Very, very few young people. It's a big problem. There are only about 7% of the workforce is under the age of 30. Now, you asked the question about localizing it, the workforce itself. And to your point, that 80+% that is outside the DC metro area, I think that the more storytelling that can be done is the best way to help local communities understand, what is actually going on with the federal workforce and why they should care. And it is every aspect of our life. And obviously, we experienced a horrific tragedy not that long ago with the crash of an airliner. We have the safest air travel system in the world, and it is because of federal employees. And federal employees, frankly, in a lot of different functions, from air traffic controllers, obviously to the TSA security officers, but also to the safety investigators who figure out what is going wrong. I mean, there's a whole architecture and ecosystem around the air travel system, including the National Weather Service at NOAA. So many, many, many parts. And I think one of the more interesting storytelling aspects that could be done is to help knit that together, to help the public understand, what is behind the experiences we have. Similarly, when you go to the grocery store and get hamburger meat to serve hamburgers to your kids, we have a very high degree of certainty that you can eat those hamburgers safely, that you're not going to get food poisoning. It happens, but very rarely. And again, that's because of meat inspectors from the Department of Agriculture. So you think about so many different aspects of our lives are really dependent upon effective service from our government. As I mentioned earlier, it can get and needs to get better, but the core of it is actually fundamentally quite amazing. And it is in every community. We're happy to try to help folks understand what is in your community in terms of agencies. There are something called the federal executive boards, and I think there are about 28 of them across the country that organize the federal presence in different communities, and that's a good resource to go to understand what is that federal presence. It's quite remarkable though. You think about the state of California has 140,000 federal employees, probably more than their state government does. So it's a big story that goes uncovered, and especially right now in terms of understanding the services that people receive and frankly the impact on the people in their community. I hope there'll be more coverage of that.
Absolutely. Just a follow-up on that. I'm thinking of local reporters, at a community paper, small town paper. Are there certain meetings, resources, places they should go as they're covering these sort of broad changes that, as you mentioned, have such a local impact? Just a follow-up question there.
Yeah, and I just started seeing that there's at least some stuff in the chat as well, but you'll tell me, what makes sense. But, I think in terms of, the connectivity piece is tough. So I think one of the things to obviously understand is right now, federal employees are deeply fearful of what is happening to them, and they don't want to make matters worse. So I think sourcing stories is unfortunately, not that easy, given the level of fear in the workforce itself. By and large, I think realistically, you are going to find that you have to go to former employees as opposed to current employees. There are unions in the federal government, and locals might be the locals of those unions, and the two largest are AFGE and NTEU. They might be, resources to help understand what is going on. I do think that there's, especially for communities that have physical establishments, so you think about like an Atlanta with the Centers for Disease Control is obviously, major employer there, but actually going to them, there's something valuable about that. There are, military bases all over the place. They have civilian employees as well. I think if you just do a little poking around, and as I noted, the federal executive boards may be pretty good resources for understanding like what are the specific entities that are in your region. VA hospitals is another, example of like a very broad network of folks that are there. The Department of Agriculture has, I think, at one point they had employees in every county of the country. And, I do think that there is something powerful about the national security piece. And it is, as I noted earlier, the most dominant aspect of what the federal government does, keeping us safe, and that's represented in the workforce. Again, broad reach, the FBI, and these are agencies that again are taking on the chin right now. I don't know that anybody has been held harmless here. It is really across the entire government. There are some places that are seeing much more disruptive activity, but we're also whatever 3+ weeks in, so it's a little daunting to think how fast the damage has been done.
Absolutely. Still early, but a lot has already taken place. We do have a great question here from our audience. Someone said that you had a fascinating slide on what people think of merit-based civil services versus what they think of a spoils system. How can we as journalists make this case more strongly, getting through to folks that the civil service actually serves them?
Yes, and I love the question, and I do think I always grew up as a data person, and I've learned over my life that doesn't actually persuade people, that the stories are the way more powerful way. And I noted someone references Michael Lewis's stuff, and I think he's the the greatest storyteller maybe of our generation in nonfiction, not obviously fiction. Um, so I think it's along the lines of what I've been describing. I think it's to bring it down to the personal, the individual. It's a lot harder. There's some great part of Alice in the Wonderland where I think it's the Red Queen, um, introduces Alice to first the roast beef and then the pudding, and then she asks Alice whether she wants a slice, and you can tell that the answer is she ultimately accepts because she's very hungry, but she doesn't want to. When you put a face on somebody, it's a lot harder to go after them. Um, I don't think there's a face on the federal workforce, and so the more that journalists can do that kind of storytelling, the more powerful. And as I noted, someone in the chat had said that they admired the Washington Post series on Who is Government. We work very closely with Michael and the Post on that series. And it's right, like it is compelling stories. And I will tell you a story that Michael shared with me. He said, and this is the first book he did, which was The Fifth Risk on this topic. He said he felt like a bank robber who had broken into the vault and grabbed a bunch of cash and ran out, leaving the gold bullion. And that cash were the stories that he told in The Fifth Risk. And that's why he wanted to come back. He assumed that everyone else would, after he did The Fifth Risk, everyone else would follow up and tell those stories. And he was surprised that there was not a whole lot more. That's why he came back with the Who is Government series with like Dave Eggers and Kamal Bell and Casey Sepp and some extraordinary Geraldine Brooks, extraordinary writers he brought to tell these stories. And, all of those writers were like, oh my gosh, there's an incredible number of other stories to tell. They have a book that's coming out March 8th, well, in mid-March. They have an event in Washington in March 18th at Sidwell Friends, and then an event in San Francisco as well on March 19th. But in any event, though, it's a long way of saying storytelling, storytelling, storytelling. So if you want, folks to understand what it is that they have and what they're losing, I think it's those stories. And I think this is probably the harder journalism, which is the more you can do to help what we're actually losing, the better as well. We have a program I mentioned earlier, the SAMMYs, the Service to American Medals. We have a website of, I think, 700 honorees. You might take a look at some of those people. They're also from across the country. But we have 20 stories from USAID, or 20 people who have done incredible stuff. I mean, that's a way of sort of making concrete what is getting lost.
Next, I think you hit it on the head with, humanizing it, putting a face to these actions that are happening. I know some of the best local coverage here in the DC area has been call-in specials on the local public radio from federal workers highlighting real-time stories of how people are impacted. So that's
I've done it. My colleague Michelle Lamonte has done it twice. So yes, I think it's also indicative of just how much pain is out there. I mean, it's actually quite difficult to communicate to the federal workforce because it's very distributed. The new administration has, unfortunately, in very short order, created a feeling of fear and distraction and chaos, which is, again, very problematic for the services that we get across the board. I mean, I've gotten call-ins, just as you said, from a Forest Service worker in Idaho. I mean, like, it's everywhere, and all afraid of what's coming at them. And I think big change could be very valuable and helpful, but the way you improve an organization is not by terrorizing your workforce. That's just horrible management, and it's horrible treatment of people.
For sure. We do have a question about how many civil servants have been fired in violation of their job protection so far, as opposed to administrative leaves, SCS transfers, and has that gotten sufficient coverage in the media?
So, I mean, partly this is moving so fast and there's not a lot of transparency, so it's difficult to know like what the full numbers are in play here. And there are different levels of damage that are done. So, civil servants, do have protections. They're not supposed to be fired on the basis of anything but actual poor performance, or if they obviously do something really wrong. I think there are still, in relative terms, small numbers that have actually been outright fired. They're consequential. For example, the inspector generals, which are a little bit of different category because they are political appointees, but they're supposed to be nonpartisan, and they're supposed to, if you're going to remove them, the law says you're supposed to actually inform Congress ahead of time so they can do something about it, and that did not happen. The federal prosecutors at DOJ are another example. But even like, it's not just firing people. You can have a legal claim even for adverse actions brought against you in other ways, and that is happening, I think, much more largely across the government. One of the things I'm most concerned about, and there are a lot, is the call out for all the what are called probationary federal employees, and those are them that have been in the federal government, for the most part, under a year. You get status or become non-probationary after a year of employment in the federal government, and it appears as if, and it certainly is being communicated as if, the intent is to try to get rid of those people. And we're talking about 150 to 200,000 federal employees. It's a lot. So it's across the board. Why it's not getting more attention, I think, again, it's coming so fast and furiously, and I think that there's just not sufficient awareness about why this is so bad. The narrative is that federal employees aren't doing their job, not doing the good work, they're the deep state, whatever it might be. And that is both wrong and enabling, less, I think, response than there ought to be. I just testified in the Homeland Security Committee on cybersecurity and cybersecurity professionals, and it's a crazy world where we face so many real threats in the cyber arena, and we have a government, a leadership group that simply is trying to get everybody to resign, including cyber professionals. I mean, it just makes no sense. We have a hearing about how we need to bring more people into this profession in government, and we've got an administration that's actually chasing that talent away. But it's journalism right now. It's always important, but this is the moment in which journalists are performing a vital function for our democracy, an urgent function for our democracy, in my view.
At the same time, we actually have a question about this, that large swaths of the public are potentially tuning out political reporting. And we know that when people lose trust in institutions, they often stop paying attention to them. How, Max, would you recommend journalists make sure that they're reaching audiences with necessary information without overwhelming them, causing news fatigue, or contributing to that issue of distrust? And I know it's a big question, but it's important.
No, it's a good one. And look, I mean, obviously journalists are, they play a refereeing role. They're not that you don't want to put your finger on the scale in one way or the other, but I think telling important stories is vital. I think there is the issue of fatigue. Someone told me this is not an outrage sprint; it's an outrage marathon that we're in right now. And on one hand, we should not enable extra bad behavior to get by because it's so bad and so extensive that you lower the bar as to what is actually meaningful to report on. But on the flip side, the human element is people do get tired and do get fatigued. I don't want to be a broken record on this. I do think that the storytelling is a good way of trying to break through, because let the readers make their own judgments about what the broader consequences are, but capture the story. And the reference to Who is Government series is a great one in this regard. There was deliberately chosen an IRS employee who was an extraordinary person, just a very interesting, fascinating person. That was one of the stories told. And it was an entry into an institution that's not well liked, but actually is pretty darn fundamental to the capability of our government and our country to have the resources it needs to meet the demands that we place on it. So I think that storytelling thing is helpful. I don't have full solution, as you just said, as to how you deal with this otherwise. But I think you have to keep sharing. And right now there's so little understanding about the civil service that I think even just that explaining piece I think could be quite useful.
Definitely. And we had a small follow-up to a question mentioned earlier. Is the partnership doing any social media campaigns on those individuals, like the Sammy Winners, because the press may not be able to do all of this fast enough at the moment?
Yeah. So I will admit that I am, my colleague Hanadi is helping out here. I am not that deep on the social media side. Obviously we have a very different landscape in terms of where people get information these days. I have done a bunch of interviewing, not a bunch, but some with influencers on YouTube and such. And I think it's important to go where the people are. We have tried. We have more work to do, honestly, to get the stories out through social media and other channels. And it's one of the areas that we're very focused on. I mean, organizationally, we are shifting our focus to do two things right now, one of which is support civil servants, and that includes providing them information that they need and engagement and community, and engaging the public. Like those are the two things that we see right now we think are vital. So and the social media piece is an aspect of what we're going to need to do more and more of. But even in a world in which social media is so prevalent, the traditional media still reaches a lot of people. And I know that the trust in traditional media has gone down, substantially, but it's in a world where there's not much in the way of institutional trust, it's still relevant. And I think we all just have to do our part as best we can.
Definitely, and you're giving me ideas for a follow-up on trust in the media. So thank you. We actually have a question. Someone wants to know if you can cite a few more examples of solid storytelling on this topic from journalists, or maybe doesn't exist yet in the way that you're describing here.
So I wish I could say more. I mentioned earlier our Sammy's program, and we do a lot of profiles ourselves of the honorees, and they're all available on our website. The Service to America medals. We try to get stories out all the time about those Sammy's honorees when they're in cycle, but those people are still either in government or retired and potential sources for you. Um, there isn't a whole lot out there, honestly, in terms of great storytelling about civil servants. I do think Michael Lewis has not not happy about the fact that he has a little bit of a corner in the market. He did bring in the collection. I think it's 6 or 7 authors, so that there is a broader set of writers that are doing this. It's also a big world, and I don't know what's out there that I'm not aware of. We have found for ourselves and the honorees that we have typically had better success with local media in terms of caring about these stories. And we can, if somebody wants that, we can try to track down some of that stuff if they're interested. But I'll say this is a real opportunity for engagement. There's another nonprofit called Solutions Journalism, and they are focused on something that I think is quite important, is thinking about how to train journalists to again look for solutions, not just problems, which I think is part of a broader challenge we have in our government. So you might check out their stuff. We've been working with them on this specific topic about how to get journalists to focus on telling the story of government better. But there's a lot of room here. So for those that want to make their name, make a difference, I'd love to see that energy put in here.
Definitely. Max, we had a question earlier about partisanship. How does one remain nonpartisan at a time like this? Feel free to answer on how the partnership does this, but it also brings to mind, the research that you're referring to, your survey. It talks about how these issues fall across party lines. Can you describe whether there is a partisan breakdown, how Democrats, Republicans respond to these issues, or if there's a demographic breakdown? Are there particular groups that are more or less likely to trust or distrust the government?
So the partisanship thing, I think, is very, very important. Cokie Roberts used to be on our board before she passed. For those who hopefully everyone still remembers who she is. She's just one of the great journalists, and she was a founding board member for the partnership, and she was always super strong on the fact that being nonpartisan was a core part of our DNA and fundamental to our ability to get stuff done. It is so built into who we are, because our point is that having an effective government is critical to our democracy and not to whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And it needs to be not bipartisan, but nonpartisan. Like it's the glue, that holds us together, that it's appropriate and part of our system to have fights over what our government should do. But whatever the political process decides that it should do, it should be done effectively and well on behalf of the public. So that's our core DNA. It is a challenging time right now because we do have an administration that has really upended 140 years of Republican and Democratic consensus that our government is supposed to be, there for the public good and not for the private agenda of the individual office holder of the moment. And my view is the fact that you currently have an administration that is returning us to the spoil system does not mean that 140-year consensus all of a sudden goes away. It still is a nonpartisan issue. You just have an administration that has gone 180 degrees on that 140 years of consensus. So being very clear about that, I think, and holding on to that and not giving up on that is very, very important in my view. And honestly, there are people who will shout out because we're taking a position in opposition to this administration on this issue, that makes us partisan, and that's just wrong. I do think that so anyway, so I think this stuff is important. I do think that, as the polling demonstrated, that actually Americans are all the way on board on this.
Hmm.
And it is I think there are some places where the consensus is more obvious, like on keeping us safe. I think everyone, independent, Republican, Democrat, all wants to see our government doing what needs to happen to keep us safe from external threat and from a lot of internal threat too. So I think there's a lot more consensus on this than the political leaders often demonstrate in their rhetoric. And that's what the polling shows. Like, this is extremely unpopular if you look at the issue itself, but the way it's being framed is not in alignment with either reality, which is why the media matters, or with what the public wants.
Definitely. I highly recommend everyone in the audience, read that report. There are a lot of great tidbits in there. Someone mentioned fact checking. What are the fact checking sites, resources that you trust?
So, the funny thing is, right now, my world is so upended that I don't get to read that much news myself, and I'm actually, getting my information from my colleagues who are sending it to me, um, and including I have two sons, both in college, and they generously send me stuff as well. I am not personally on social media. I have a LinkedIn account, etc. But so I don't get my news from, social media, other than if it's, intermediated by somebody who forwards it to me. I do read, consistently when I can, The Economist, which I think is a great publication, and um, you know, um, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg News. I get their newsletters, in the New York Times. So again, I'm old school still for myself, and I look to others to help me, get insight into other things. And I think it's really important, obviously, for all of us to understand what is happening in the news media ecosystem. But I will admit that I'm not up to speed.
That's quite all right. I will point to one of the recent Q&As that we at the Institute did. We actually interviewed PolitiFact about their fact checking on
Yes.
promises that campaigns make and that
Yeah.
presidents then make. So
Yeah. Yeah. And
they're
I've talked to the founder of that. It's great stuff. I think it's important. I think it's in this age, it's so important to have that function, because there is so much information. And, again, with kids, you realize it's a different world that they have to be able to understand and to navigate through, and understand like what can be trusted.
absolutely. And one of the things that came out of that Q&A is that it's just reporting on what was promised and whether that promise was kept, right? And that sort of falls on a nonpartisan line. One of the main issues that your organization is focused on is the government's long struggle with recruiting a young,
Yeah.
diverse workforce. At present, the Trump administration has, of course, ordered the ending of federal DEI programs. What impact could policies like this have on a robust civil service and restoring public trust in the government?
Yeah. No, I mean, they've also have a hiring freeze, and they're collecting the names of all the new hires, and they're all with the real risk that those folks are going to be first on the chopping block. So you think about, again, those are the young folks that will be more represented in that swath than anybody else. So it's incredibly damaging to the existing workforce, to the pipeline of folks that you want to have come in. This is just What is deeply sad about this is there's a world in which you would say, hey, we want to shrink government. I would say you should be respecting the constitutional um, division of labor in terms of what Congress is supposed to do versus the executive branch, and that is not happening right now. Um, we have done a thoughtful review of the federal workforce, and we think we have, too many of this occupation and this agency, or we want to make sure we're getting rid of the poor performers we have more effectively. None of that is happening here. This is all, arbitrary and almost random fear and pushing people into resignation. So you think about it again, there's no organizational leader that I've ever met in my entire life that would say what is happening now is good management. It just isn't. It's terrible management. And that terrible management, when you're dealing with our government, has phenomenal consequences for all of our safety and as we've discussed, the services we receive from our government, and has consequences for the people in government. So young people, as hard as it is to get them into government in the past, we just made it 100 times harder. And the young people that are in government today are likely to be chased away too. So that kind of diversity is incredibly important. You raise the question of DEI. I think part of the challenge we're seeing right now is that rubric is being used to sweep up a whole bunch of stuff. And what everyone may think about, versus various elements of it, it can't be right to create an environment where you don't respect the need to find talent in all different kinds of communities, the need to create environments for working where people can bring their whole self to work and feel like they can do their best and are supported in doing so. These are things that are just plain good management. And the research is clear as can be, and the experience is clear as can be that that's the case. So, this would be bad if you were talking about a private sector company to see something managed in this way, and it's tragic when it's our federal government. We have one tool for collective action to deal with our biggest problems that has imprimatur of the public and taxpayer resources behind it, and that's our federal government. And it's being destroyed, and it's not the buildings, it's the people. It's always the people that matter, and it's the civil servants. The political leaders come and go, and you want to make sure you get good leaders, but the long-term asset is that public, sector resource workforce, the civil servants, and it is being demolished.
There's so much, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of how much information is out there right now, how much is happening so fast. One of the tools I want to draw attention to is the partnership's political appointments tracker in partnership with the Washington Post.
Yep.
Can you speak to that tool? How journalists can best utilize that, and any other tools that journalists need right now as they're covering this mammoth, issue?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think thank you for highlighting that. Data can be powerful, and unfortunately, we're losing a bunch of the data that government provides, and that's a big problem. But one of the things we believe that leaders matter, and the Senate confirmed leadership in our government is by and large the most senior folks in our entire government, and the system we have of getting those in place is deeply broken, and we can see that through our tracker. So there's a sort of system insight that tracker provides in terms of understanding how slow the process has become and debilitating to get leaders into place. The way I think journalists can use the tracker is to understand specifically where people are in the pipeline. Now, again, to give context, in the normal world, you have 4,000 political appointments that a president gets to make. Really helpful to know that our peer democracies in the world, they count their political appointees in tens, not thousands. So we are already still way over on the sort of politicization of the government, certainly the leadership, than any other democracy that I know of in our world. But the top ones are the Senate confirmed ones, and that's about 1,300. And it at least provides some transparency in understanding who those people are, where they are in the process, and it's a very, I think, intuitive to use resource where you can search different agencies you might care about. You can understand, where those individuals are in the process, and sometimes the delay is caused by the administration not nominating somebody versus the Senate not voting on somebody. But it's a one-stop shop for all that. We've also been involved in trying to get legislation passed that was passed to modernize what's called the Plum Book, which is sort of a collection of all the political appointees, and trying to make that a more frequent occurrence. It was done every 4 years, and sort of as a compromise, we wanted it real time, but it's now every year that they're supposed to update that. But that's also another good resource to understand what's going on. But I do think as journalists, one of the most intriguing stories going on right now is who is leading our government. Because I mentioned the political appointees who are, but there are very few Senate confirmed individuals that are in place. And that means that there are non-Senate confirmed political appointees that are actually making all these choices that are all causing all this chaos, which comes to a question in the Q&A, which I'd love to get to. But the proposition for me here is, if reporters can try to figure out who in fact is there, it's the tracker that we do tells you all about the Senate confirmed ones. I would describe that as the iceberg above the waterline, and then the 2,600 plus non-Senate confirmed people are below the waterline. So figuring out who they are is very important. You think about the Doge folks, which are sort of over on top of all the ones. Like, who are these people? We're seeing some reporting on this, but it's worth doing, because they're jobs of public import, and the public has a right to know who they are and what their capabilities are. And even more broadly, we think there should be performance plans for all political appointees, as there are for civil servants. So, Elliot, I don't know if you want, but there is that question that I'd love to get to in the Q&A.
Absolutely.
All right.
There's a question about what role the agency heads have in this, and can they serve their employees in a way different than the White House and those writing the executive orders right now?
Yeah, and this is sort of just a quick follow-on of what I just said, which is it is true there are not that many. There are now increasing numbers of cabinet agency leaders that are in place. But unfortunately, in most of these agencies, you go 4 or 5 levels down in the hierarchy, and they're all political appointees. And that's going to take, again, a very long time before those people are in place. But I do think that at least in those instances, you have people who have been vetted by the United States Senate at some level. My hope is you will find more people who have either management capability or understanding about the importance of engaging employees rather than undermining them. And I know of a number of people who have been nominated for those positions inside agencies who I think are very strong. So I am actually optimistic about the possibility that we'll see better days once you have confirmed leadership across the board and deeper into these agencies. I think it will be uneven, but to be honest, I'm not sure you could see worse than we're getting right now. Like, this is really like way, way beyond anything that I could even conceive of. But I think there's some chance we'll actually see good in some places. I spoke to a leader yesterday who's been nominated, who I think is very strong, and I think will be a big change from what we have right now.
Well, it's great to end on a positive note, Max. We're coming to time here, but is there anything you want to add, any final thoughts, especially as it relates to journalists and their role in dispelling or addressing distrust in the government?
Yeah, look, I just first want to say thank you again for all those that have taken the time to participate here, as well as those that are, especially those who are serving as journalists, because I think you are the fourth branch. Your work is fundamental to the health of our democracy, and I think especially now. So thank you.
Thank you, Max. Thank you to the Partnership for Public Service and to our audience for great questions. We've packed a lot of information into our brief time together, and we'll share a link with the recording of this soon, along with the resources in the chat. The National Press Club Journalism Institute is proud to produce training and briefings like this at no cost to journalists across the U.S. with the mission of powering strong journalism in the public interest. If you'd like to support us in this work, we hope you'll consider making a donation today. And please spare a few minutes to fill out a survey to tell us how we did today and to help us improve our programming. Thank you again, Max, for joining us and for your wonderful insights.
Thank
And
you.
absolutely. And thank you all for joining us today. Stay well. And again, if you can share where you're tuning in from, we'll be saving this information for future programming to help inform us. Stay well. We hope you'll all join us again soon.